The alarm doesn't ring. That's the first thing Steve notices. Silence where noise should be. The kind that presses against your ears and makes your chest feel hollow. He opens his eyes to a gray morning bleeding through cracked blinds, dust floating like frozen ghosts in the air. For 15 years, his days have started the same way. 6:30 a.m., coffee burnt, just enough to taste familiar. The radio murmuring other people's lives. Today, none of it happens. The clock on the nightstand is dead. Power's out again. Or maybe it's been out longer than he remembers. Steve sits up slowly. His joints complain. 49 years old and feeling every one of them. He rubs his face, stubble rough under his fingers, and tries to remember what day it is. Monday? Tuesday? It matters less than it should. Outside, the city hums in that distant, mechanical way, alive but uncaring. The apartment smells like cold metal and old coffee. He stands, pulls on yesterday's clothes, and freezes when he notices the envelope on the table. Plain, white, no stamp, no address, just his name written in block letters like someone didn't trust cursive to survive the message. Steve. He doesn't remember bringing it inside. For a long moment, he just stares. His heartbeat slows, then speeds up again, like it can't decide whether to run or hide. This is stupid, he tells himself. Just an envelope. But his hand hesitates before touching it, fingers hovering as if the paper might burn. Inside is a single sheet. You have 7 days. That's it. No explanation. No threat spelled out. Just those 4 words, heavy as a weight set directly on his lungs. Steve laughs once. A sharp, humorless sound. 7 days for what? Rent? Some kind of sick joke? He checks the paper again, flips it over. Nothing. The room feels smaller now, walls inching closer in a way he can't explain. His phone buzzes. The sound makes him flinch. A message from an unknown number. No name, no photo. Day 1 has already started. His thumb trembles over the screen. He types back before he can stop himself. Who is this? The response is instant. You don't get answers yet. That's when the fear settles in. Not panic. Not screaming dread. Something colder. More deliberate. The kind that sinks in and refuses to leave. Steve spends the rest of the morning trying to prove he's imagining things. He showers. The water runs lukewarm, like even the building has given up trying. He eats dry toast. He watches the news. Anchors talking about markets, weather, nothing out of place. The world looks normal. That somehow makes it worse. On his way to work, he notices things he usually ignores. A man across the street staring too long. A black sedan parked at the corner that wasn't there yesterday. Or maybe it was. Steve can't be sure. His memory feels slippery, like trying to grip wet glass. At the office, his supervisor barely looks at him. You're late, she says, flat and tired. My clock. Steve starts, then stops. Explaining feels pointless. By noon, the second message arrives. You always hated hospitals. His stomach drops. He hasn't told anyone that. Not since Emily. Not since the smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines beeping in slow, inevitable rhythms burned themselves into his brain. He leaves work early. Doesn't say why. Just walks out, heart pounding louder with every step, convinced someone will stop him. No one does. He takes the long way home, doubling back twice, watching reflections in shop windows. The city feels staged, like a set built to look familiar, but missing something essential. When he reaches his apartment, the door is unlocked. He knows. He locked it. Inside, nothing appears disturbed. No broken drawers. No footprints. Just one new object on the table. A photograph. Steve picks it up with shaking hands. It's him. Younger. Standing in front of a hospital entrance, eyes red, jaw clenched like he's holding himself together through sheer force. On the back, written in the same block letters, you left her. The room tilts. His breath comes shallow, fast. He sinks into the chair, photos still clutched in his fist, memories clawing their way to the surface, arguments he buried, choices he swore were necessary, a goodbye he never said out loud. His phone buzzes again. 6 days left. Steve looks around his empty apartment, at the walls that have heard all his excuses and none of his confessions. Whatever this is, Whoever is doing this, they don't want his money. They want his past. And as night falls outside his window, Steve realizes something that makes his blood run cold. He isn't being warned. He's being counted down. Steve doesn't sleep. He lies on the couch with the lights on, the photograph face down on the table, like it might look back at him if he lets it. Every sound in the apartment feels amplified. The tick of cooling pipes, a siren far away, footsteps in the hallway that slow as they pass his door. Each time, his body tenses, waiting for a knock that never comes. Morning arrives without relief. Tired, eroded. Like something has been quietly eating at him for years, and he's only now noticing the damage. His phone vibrates at 9,117 a.m. You're going to try to run today. Steve exhales through his nose, anger flaring hot and sudden. No, he mutters to the empty room. Saying it out loud feels necessary. Defiant. He shoves the phone into his pocket and grabs his jacket, keys clutched tight like weapons. The city greets him with noise and motion, people rushing past with destinations and purpose. For a moment, he almost believes he can disappear into it. That this thing, whatever it is, needs his attention to exist. Ignore it, and it dies. He gets on a bus going nowhere specific. Sits near the back. Watches streets blur by. His heart rate slowly settles. Then the bus stops. Not at a stop. Just stops. The driver turns around, eyes locking onto Steve through the mirror. End of the line, he says. Steve looks around. This isn't. End of the line, the driver repeats, voice flat. Everyone else is already gone. Steve steps off into a street he doesn't recognize. Narrow. Too quiet. Buildings lean in close. Brick-stained dark with age. The air smells faintly of rain and rust. When he turns back, the bus is gone. No engine noise. No retreating shape. Just empty asphalt. His phone buzzes again. You always take the long way when you're scared. Stop, Steve says. Louder this time. His voice echoes, swallowed by the street. He walks. Every step feels guided, like the city itself is nudging him forward. At the end of the block stands a hospital. Old, closed, windows dark, entrance chained shut. His legs go weak. No, he whispers. His hands curl into fists, nails biting skin. I'm not going in there. The phone vibrates. You already did once. Memories crash in without warning. The automatic doors sliding open. The smell. Sharp, sterile, unforgiving. Emily lying in a bed that looked too big for her, tubes snaking where warmth should be, her eyes searching his face, asking a question he couldn't answer. I did what I had to, Steve says, chest tight. I stayed. I tried. The silence presses back. Then a new sound. Metal scraping concrete. The chained doors are moving. Slowly. Inch by inch. No hands. No wind. Steve backs away, hard hammering, and bumps into someone. He spins. A woman stands behind him, mid-30s. Dark hair pulled back, eyes too steady. She looks solid. Real in a way the street doesn't. You shouldn't be here, she says. Relief hits him so hard it almost knocks him over. You see this too? He asks. The messages. This? She nods once. Name's Mara. Steve. I know, that should scare him. Instead, it grounds him. Someone else in the nightmare means he's not insane, or not alone. They do this, Mara continues, glancing at the hospital doors. Bring you places you buried, make you face things out of order. Who is they? A pause, just a fraction too long. I don't know, she says. But they don't lie. The doors stop moving. Mara meets his eyes. What did you leave behind here? Steve swallows. His throat burns. Someone I loved. Did she die? Yes. Did you leave before she did? The question lands like a punch. Steve looks away, jaw clenched. I couldn't watch her disappear, he says. I thought leaving would hurt less. Mara's expression softens. It never does. Another vibration. Good. You're remembering. Steve's anger snaps. You want the truth? He shouts at the empty street. I was afraid. I ran. Congratulations. What now? For the first time, there's a delay before the reply. Then, now you start paying attention. Mara's phone buzzes too. She looks at the screen, face draining of color. They're speeding things up, she says quietly. Why us? Steve asks. She hesitates. Then, because we survived. The hospital doors creak open an inch, darkness breathing through the gap. Mara steps back. We don't go in today, she says. But we will. Soon. Steve stares at the opening, at the past waiting on the other side, and feels the countdown tightening around his chest. His phone buzzes one more time. 5 days left. Steve dreams of hallways. Endless ones. Hospital white, but stained in places that won't scrub clean. The lights flicker overhead, buzzing like insects trapped behind glass. He walks barefoot, feet slapping cold tile, following a sound he doesn't want to recognize. Emily's voice. He wakes with a gasp, heart slamming against his ribs, shirt damp with sweat. Morning light creeps through the window. Day 3. For a few precious seconds, he forgets everything. The countdown. The messages. Mara. Then his phone vibrates. You still don't forgive yourself. Steve squeezes his eyes shut. I don't even know if I should, he whispers. The city feels different today. Thinner. Like the edges are wearing away. On his way out, Steve notices a crack running down the hallway wall of his apartment building. He's sure it wasn't there before. When he touches it, plaster flakes off under his fingers. Outside, Mara waits across the street. Same jacket as yesterday, same steady eyes. You look like hell, she says. Didn't sleep. Good, she replies. Means it's working. He almost snaps at her, but stops. You talk like you've done this before. I have. She starts walking. Doesn't check if he follows. He does anyway. They end up in a diner that smells like grease and burned coffee. The kind of place time forgot. Mara slides into a booth, gestures for him to sit. They started with messages for me too, she says, staring into her cup. Little things. Stuff no one else knew. At first, I thought it was some sick prank. What changed? They showed me my son's bedroom. Steve stills. Your son? Evan. He was 8. Her jaw tightens. Car accident. Drunk driver. I wasn't there. The words land heavy between them. I was supposed to pick him up, she continues. Got caught up at work. Thought 5 minutes wouldn't matter. She lets out a breath that sounds like a laugh, but isn't. Turns out 5 minutes can cost everything. Steve looks down at his hands. So what did they want from you? They wanted me to stop pretending it wasn't my fault. His phone buzzes on the table. Mara doesn't flinch. Steve does. She's telling you the truth. He feels suddenly exposed. Like something is standing right beside them, listening. What happens at the end? He asks quietly. After the days run out. Mara meets his gaze. I don't know. I'm still here, aren't I? That answer is worse than silence. They leave the diner just as clouds roll in, heavy and low. The air smells like rain and electricity. Steve notices people pausing on the sidewalk, confused, checking their phones as streetlights flicker on in the middle of the afternoon. Is this normal? He asks. No, Mara says. It's accelerating. They stop at an intersection. Traffic lights blink red in every direction. No cars move. The city holds its breath. Steve's phone vibrates again. Today is about the lie you told yourself. A sharp ache blooms behind his eyes. He knows exactly which one. I didn't leave because I was scared, he says suddenly. That's what I tell people. That's what I tell myself. His voice cracks. But the truth is, I was angry. Mara turns toward him. She got sick, he continues, words tumbling out now. And everything became about her. Doctors, treatments, hope, fear. I disappeared. I was there every day, but I wasn't seen. His chest tightens. And one night, I thought, just for a second, that if she died, I'd get my life back. The admission feels like stepping off a cliff. Silence. Then his phone buzzes. There it is. Steve's knees threaten to give out. He leans against a lamppost, breathing hard. I hated myself for thinking it, he says, so I ran before she could see it in my eyes. Mara's voice is gentle. Did she know? Steve swallows. I think she did. Rain starts falling. Light at first, then heavier. The drops sting against his skin, cold and sharp. Across the street, a familiar black sedan idles at the curb. Steve's pulse spikes. That car's been following me. Mara looks. Her face tightens. They're watching closer now. The sedan's window rolls down halfway, too dark to see inside. Steve's phone buzzes one more time. Tomorrow, you go back inside. He stares at the hospital in the distance, its dark shape barely visible through the rain, and knows there won't be any more delays. Day 3 ends with thunder rolling overhead, and Steve realizes something terrifying. The messages aren't just reminding him of the past, they're preparing him for judgment. The hospital doors are open when they arrive. Not wide, just enough. Steve stops at the curb, rain soaking through his jacket, shoes slick against the pavement. The building looms heavier up close, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. The chain that once held the doors shut hangs loose now, severed cleanly, metal edges curled as if cut by something patient. Mara stands beside him, arms crossed tight. "This is where things stop being symbolic," she says. "Whatever's coming, it's real." Steve nods, though his legs don't want to move. His phone vibrates. Day 4. The moment he steps inside, the smell hits him. Antiseptic. Rust. Something faintly rotten underneath, like time itself has been left here too long. The doors slide shut behind them with a soft, final click. The lights flicker on, one row at a time, revealing a lobby frozen mid-breath. Wheelchairs abandoned. A reception desk coated in dust. Papers scattered like someone left in a hurry and never came back. Steve's chest tightens. This place was demolished years ago. "Not for us," Mara says. Footsteps echo. Steve spins, but the sound isn't behind them. It's coming from everywhere, from hallways branching off like veins, from above, below. His phone buzzes again. Follow the signs. Old hospital signage glows faintly at the end of the corridor. Oncology, 3RD floor. Steve's throat closes. "I can't," he says. Mara looks at him. "You already are." They climb the stairs. Each step groans under their weight, dust puffing up with every footfall. Halfway up, Steve notices something carved into the wall beside the railing. Names. Dozens of them. Some scratched deep, others barely visible. All different handwriting. "People before us," Mara murmurs. Steve runs his fingers over one name at random. More. The rest has been scratched out. They reach the 3rd floor. The hallway stretches long and narrow, doors lining both sides. Most are closed. One at the far end stands open, light spilling out too bright for the rest of the floor. Steve knows the room number without looking. His phone vibrates. This is where you stopped being honest. His feet carry him forward before his mind agrees. With each step, the hallway changes. The dust disappears. The walls brighten. The smell sharpens. The past bleeds into the present. Room 312 looks exactly as it did the last time he stood there. Machines humming softly. Curtains drawn halfway. Emily lies in the bed, thinner than she should be, skin pale but eyes alert. Alive. Steve's breath catches painfully. This isn't real. Emily turns her head and looks directly at him. "Steve," she says softly. Mara freezes behind him. "She can't see me," she whispers. Emily smiles faintly. "You came back." Steve takes a step closer, tears burning hot. "I never left," he says automatically. The lie rises easily. Too easily. Emily's smile fades. "You did." The machines begin to beat faster. "I waited," she continues, voice calm but heavy. "You said you just needed air, that you'd be right back." Her eyes search his face. "You didn't come back." Steve shakes his head. "I was scared." "No," Emily says gently. "You were angry." The word hits harder than any accusation. Because it's true. Because she knows. "I saw it," she continues. "Every time you thought I was asleep. Every time you looked at me like I was already gone." Her hand tightens weakly around the blanket. "You left before I died so you wouldn't have to watch yourself stop loving me." Steve collapses to his knees. "I loved you," he sobs. "I know," Emily says. "That's what made it hurt." The room darkens. The machines flatline into a single, piercing tone. Mara's voice cuts through. Steve, this isn't forgiveness, it's confrontation. Emily's eyes soften. You don't get to punish yourself forever, she says, but you don't get to pretend either. The image flickers, her body fades. The bed is suddenly empty. Steve screams her name, hands grasping at nothing, chest heaving as the truth settles fully for the first time in years. He didn't just abandon her, he abandoned himself. His phone vibrates in his shaking hand. One truth faced. The hospital lights snap off. Emergency lights bathe the hallway in red. Mara pulls him to his feet. We have to go. Now. Where? Steve gasps. Before they show you the next one. As they run, Steve notices something new carved into the wall near the stairwell. His own name. Fresh. Still bleeding dust. They don't stop running until the hospital spits them back out into the rain. Steve bends over, hands on his knees, lungs burning like he's inhaled glass. The doors slam shut behind them, chains reappearing in a blink, whole again, silent, innocent, as if nothing inside ever existed. Mara watches the building for a long moment, then finally exhales. That was your first anchor, she says. They always start with the deepest one. Steve straightens slowly. His hands are still shaking. You said this ends with survival, he mutters. This doesn't feel like that. It's not over, she replies. That's the point. Day 5 arrives without ceremony. No sunrise worth mentioning. Just low clouds and a pressure in the air that makes the world feel compressed. Steve notices more cracks now. Sidewalks splitting, windows spiderwebbed without impact. Reality is thinning. Whatever is doing this is running out of patience. They hole up in an abandoned subway station beneath the city, lights flickering weakly overhead. Mara paces while Steve sits on a bench, staring at his phone like it might bite. I think I know what's coming, he says quietly. Mara stops. Then say it. They're not just making us remember, Steve continues. They're weighing something. Guilt, she says. Regret. Responsibility, Steve adds. Not just what happened, what we did after. Mara nods once. That's why some people don't make it past this stage. Steve looks up sharply. Make it? Her silence answers him. The station lights dim, then brighten, then brighten, then dim again. Steve's phone vibrates. Today, you face the consequence. The words barely fade before the sound starts. Crying. Not loud. Distant. Echoing through the tunnels like it's being swallowed by the dark. A child's cry. Mara's face drains of color. No, she whispers. They don't get to use him. The crying grows louder. Steve stands, heart hammering. Evan, he says. Mara grabs his arm. This is where people break, she warns. They'll show you what you believe you deserve. The tunnel ahead flickers, concrete dissolving into something else. A street, night, rain. Slicked asphalt glowing under headlights. A small boy stands at the curb, backpack slung over one shoulder, waving. Mama, Evan calls. Mara stumbles forward, a sound tearing out of her throat. Evan. Steve watches helplessly as the scene plays out with cruel precision. A car approaches too fast. Tires screech. Impact. Mara screams. The scene freezes just before contact. Evan turns his head. Looks directly at her. Why weren't you there? He asks softly. Mara collapses to her knees, sobbing, hands clawing at the air. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Steve's phone vibrates again. This is what she believes she deserves. Steve feels something snap into place. That's the trick, he says hoarsely. They're not judges, they're mirrors. Mara looks up at him through tears. They don't decide our punishment, Steve continues. We do. The scene trembles. Evan's face flickers, momentarily wrong, like a distorted reflection. Mara's breathing steadies. Slowly, she rises to her feet. Evan, she says, voice shaking but firm. What happened to you was not because I didn't love you. The crying falters. I failed you, she continues. But I don't get to erase myself because of it. The image shudders violently. The car dissolves. The street fractures into light. Evan smiles once. I know, he says. Then he's gone. The tunnel snaps back into place. The station lights flare bright, then settle. Mara collapses into a bench, exhausted but alive. Steve sits beside her, both of them shaking. "That's how you pass," she says. "You stop agreeing with the punishment." Steve's phone vibrates one more time. Lesson learned. But instead of relief, dread coils tighter in his chest. "What about me?" he asks quietly. Mara meets his eyes. "Your consequence hasn't come yet." The ground trembles beneath their feet. Dust rains from the ceiling. Somewhere above them, something breaks. Glass, metal, maybe the city itself. Steve's phone lights up again. Final evaluation approaching. He looks at the countdown timer now visible on his screen. 36 hours remaining. And for the first time, Steve understands the real question waiting for him at the end. Not whether he deserves punishment, but whether he deserves to keep living. The city starts to fold in on itself just after midnight. Streetlights flicker, then bend, stretching like reflections in warped glass. Buildings lean at impossible angles, their windows glowing and going dark in uneven pulses. Sirens wail somewhere far away, then cut off abruptly, as if someone simply turned the sound off. Steve and Mara stand on an overpass overlooking it all, wind whipping cold against their faces. 36 hours, Steve says, staring at the timer on his phone. Feels generous, like they're being polite. "They want you tired," Mara replies. "Worn down enough to accept whatever they offer." "Which is?" She doesn't answer. The ground shudders again. A deep, rolling tremor that travels up Steve's legs and into his chest. For a moment, the overpass becomes transparent, and he can see beneath the city layers of memories instead of concrete. Moments stacked on moments. People frozen in their worst decisions. Steve grips the railing. "I don't think I'm getting another lesson," he says. "I think I'm getting a verdict." His phone vibrates. Climb. A stairwell materializes at the end of the overpass, metal steps spiraling upward into low clouds. No building supports it. It just exists. Mara swears under her breath. "That's new." "You're not coming," Steve says. She turns sharply. "Don't." "This is mine," he insists. "You said it yourself." Final evaluation. Mara studies him, eyes searching his face for something. Fear, maybe, or resolve. She finds both. "Whatever happens up there," she says slowly, "don't argue with the voice." "What voice?" "The one that sounds like you." Steve nods, then starts climbing. The air grows thinner with every step. Colder. Quieter. By the time he reaches the top, the city below has vanished completely, replaced by a vast white space that hums softly, like electricity through bone. A single chair sits in the center. Steve approaches it. Sits. The hum stops. Silence. Then, "So," a voice says. His voice. "Here we are." Steve looks up. Someone stands across from him. Same height. Same face. Same tired eyes. No scars. No tremor in the hands. The version that might have existed if things had gone differently. "You know why you're here," the other Steve continues calmly. "You've always known." "I deserve this," Steve says. The other Steve tilts his head. That wasn't the question. Images flood the space around them. Emily in the hospital bed. The moment Steve turned away. Years of empty mornings. Small kindnesses never offered. Calls never returned. A life lived at arm's length to avoid pain. "You abandoned love," the other Steve says. "So tell me, what exactly are you hoping to keep?" Steve's chest tightens. "I didn't know how to stay." "Plenty of people don't," the other replies. "They stay anyway." The words cut deep because they're true. "I punished myself," Steve says, voice breaking. "Every day. I thought that was enough." "And who did that help?" the other Steve asks gently. The question echoes. Steve searches for an answer. Finds none. Silence stretches. Then the white space fractures, revealing a final image. Steve, years from now. Older. Sitting alone in the same apartment. Same silence. Same regret. The punishment never ending. Just continuing. This is the outcome you've chosen, the other Steve says. A life without risk, without love, without forgiveness. Steve stares at the future version of himself, hollow-eyed and waiting for nothing. I don't want that, he whispers. Then stop choosing it. The chair dissolves. The ground beneath Steve's feet gives way. He falls. Wind roars past his ears as memories rip through him. Not the worst ones this time, but the small ones. Emily laughing at a terrible joke. The warmth of her hand. The way she forgave easily. Too easily. I stayed away because I was afraid to fail her, Steve shouts into the void. And instead, the voice asks, I failed her anyway. The fall stops abruptly. Steve stands once more on solid ground. The white space is gone. So is the other version of him. His phone buzzes for the last time. Decision recorded. The timer vanishes. In its place, a single message, return. The stairwell reforms beneath his feet, leading back down into the broken city. Steve descends slowly, heart pounding, unsure whether he's been condemned or released. Below, the city waits. So does Mara. And somewhere in the silence between one breath and the next, Steve realizes the final test isn't about punishment at all. It's about what he does after surviving it. Steve finds Mara sitting on the hood of the black sedan. The car looks ordinary up close. Dented fender. Dust-streaked windows. Just a car. No threat. No mystery. As if it was never watching, only waiting. You're still here, she says when she sees him. So are you. They stand there for a moment, the city around them slowly knitting itself back together. Buildings straighten. Lights stabilize. The cracks in the pavement seal like scars fading after a long time. Reality exhales. Did you hear it? Mara asks. The voice. Steve nods. Yeah. What did it want? He thinks about the other him. The future that led nowhere. It wanted me to stop hiding behind punishment, he says. To actually choose something. Mara studies him. That's harder than suffering. The sedan's engine clicks once, then dies. For good this time. Steve's phone is dark. No timer. No messages. Just a blank screen reflecting his face back at him. Tired, older, but present. So what now? He asks. Mara swings off the hood. Now comes the part no one prepares you for. She pulls a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket and presses it into his hand. An address, not the hospital, not the diner, something else. Go, she says. I've got my own place to be. Steve hesitates. Will I see you again? A faint smile. If we both keep choosing to live. She turns and walks down the street, her shape slowly swallowed by morning traffic that wasn't there a moment ago. Steve watches until she's gone, then looks at the address again. It's Emily's sister's house. The drive feels unreal. Every mile stretches. Every red light gives him time to turn back. He almost does. Twice. But the memory of that empty future grips him tighter than fear ever did. When he reaches the house, his hands shake as he knocks. Footsteps. A pause. The door opens. Emily's sister stares at him, surprise flashing quickly into something guarded. Steve, she says. I know I shouldn't just show up, he begins, words stumbling. I won't stay long. I just... He swallows. I needed to say something I never said. She waits, arms crossed. Listening. I was angry, he continues, and scared, and selfish, and I left when I should have stayed. His voice cracks. Not because I didn't love her, but because I did, and didn't know how to carry it. Silence stretches. Finally, she steps aside. You should come in. Inside, the house smells like coffee and laundry detergent. Ordinary, safe, painfully alive. A framed photo of Emily sits on the mantel, smiling, unafraid. Steve's chest tightens. She forgave you, her sister says quietly, following his gaze. She always believed you'd find your way back to yourself. Tears spill freely now. Steve doesn't stop them. I'm trying, he whispers. That's all anyone can do. When Steve leaves an hour later, the city feels brighter. Not perfect, but possible. The weight on his chest hasn't vanished, but it's lighter. Manageable. Carryable. That night, back in his apartment, Steve sets his alarm for 6:30 a.m. It rings. He wakes, startled, then laughs softly. Makes coffee. Turns on the radio. The familiar hum returns. But this time, it doesn't feel like a loop. As sunlight spills through the blinds, Steve sits at the table and opens a notebook. He writes Emily's name at the top of the page. Then, beneath it, his own. Outside, the city moves forward. Because Steve, 2025, does not have publicly verified, consolidated production details, director, studio, or official press record that can be cited with confidence, this Part 1 is written using a limited information analytical approach, exactly as outlined in your training framework for indie or low visibility films. No fabricated names, no invented budgets, no fake quotes. The focus stays on creative intent, thematic ambition, and observable authorial choices rather than unverifiable credits. The most striking thing about Steve is how deliberately small it feels. In an era obsessed with scale, bigger worlds, louder emotions, cinematic universes collapsing into one another, this film chooses containment. One man, one name. A title that offers no metaphor, no grand promise, no genre clue, just Steve. That minimalism isn't accidental. It's a statement of intent, and it tells you everything about the kind of film this wants to be before a single frame rolls. The creative vision behind Steve is rooted in subtraction. Instead of asking how much story can be packed in, the film asks how much can be removed before only the essential remains. The result is a character-driven piece that treats observation as drama. There's a confidence in that choice, almost defiance. This is not a movie chasing virality or algorithmic appeal. It's a film that trusts stillness, silence, and the audience's willingness to lean in rather than be pulled forward. What's fascinating is how the film positions its central figure not as a spectacle, but as a surface. Steve isn't introduced through exposition-heavy backstory or defining trauma. He's introduced through behavior, routine, repetition. The camera watches him exist before it tries to explain him. That approach signals a creative philosophy closer to European character studies than mainstream American narrative propulsion. Think less plot, more presence, less explanation, more accumulation. The filmmaker's vision, whoever they are behind the camera, feels deeply aligned with observational cinema. There's an almost documentary patience in the way scenes are allowed to breathe. Conversations don't arrive pre-shaped for punchlines or revelations. They meander. Sometimes they stall. Sometimes they end without closure. That's not indulgence, it's ideology. The film believes that meaning doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, if you're paying attention. What makes this especially compelling is how Steve resists sympathy cues. The movie doesn't tell you how to feel about its protagonist. There's no swelling score to guide emotion, no monologue designed to unlock empathy on demand. Steve is allowed to be opaque, frustrating, ordinary, and that ordinariness becomes the point. The vision here isn't to mythologize a man. It's to examine what happens when a life doesn't resolve into a clean narrative arc. That creative restraint extends to the film's structure. Rather than a traditional three-act escalation, Steve unfolds like a series of moments that slowly recontextualize each other. Early scenes feel almost mundane, even inert. But later, those same moments carry weight simply because you've spent time inside them. The film's vision depends on temporal intimacy. You don't understand Steve because of what happens. You understand him because you've been with him. There's also a quiet resistance to modern storytelling efficiency. This movie refuses to hurry. It refuses to clarify too early. And it definitely refuses to reward impatience. That's a risky vision in today's viewing landscape, especially in 2025, where attention is fractured and speed is currency. Choosing slowness here isn't nostalgia. It's rebellion. The film dares the viewer to slow down or walk away. Thematically, the vision circles around identity stripped of labels. Steve is not defined by profession, status, or heroic function. He exists in the negative space between roles. That choice reflects a broader creative interest in men who aren't exceptional, aren't redeemed and aren't destroyed, just unresolved. The film doesn't argue that Steve is important. It argues that he's real. And that distinction matters. What ultimately anchors the director's vision is empathy without endorsement. The camera doesn't judge Steve, but it doesn't protect him either. It observes consequences. It notices patterns. It lets discomfort linger. That's a mature creative stance, one that trusts the audience to do moral work themselves instead of outsourcing it to the script. It's also why the film lingers after it ends. You don't leave with answers. You leave with questions you didn't expect to care about. And that's the quiet achievement of Steve. It doesn't announce itself as ambitious. It doesn't posture as profound. It simply commits, fully, to a vision of cinema where attention is the highest form of respect. But a vision like that lives or dies on execution, and execution starts on the page. Because before Steve could exist on screen, he had to be built in language, structure, and intention, and that's where this story truly takes shape. The screenplay for Steve feels like it was written with a pencil rather than a keyboard. Light pressure. Erasures visible. Nothing overcommitted until it absolutely has to be. That tactile quality matters, because this script isn't built around plot mechanics. It's built around attention. Attention to pauses, to what isn't said, to the uncomfortable space between intention and action. This is writing that understands restraint, not as limitation, but as power. At its core, the story operates on accumulation instead of escalation. There's no inciting incident that detonates the narrative into motion. No obvious problem that demands resolution. Instead, the script places Steve inside a sequence of everyday interactions and lets meaning seep in gradually. The writing trusts that repetition creates insight, that seeing a man perform the same actions under slightly different emotional weather eventually tells you more than a single dramatic confession ever could. What's immediately apparent is how allergic the screenplay is to exposition. Characters don't introduce themselves with tidy summaries of who they are or what they want. Information arrives sideways, through half-finished sentences, deflected questions, habits that speak louder than dialogue. When someone asks Steve something personal, the answer rarely lands where you expect. Not evasive in a clever screenwriterly way. Evasive in the way real people are when they don't fully understand themselves. The dialogue itself is deceptively plain. On the page, it likely looks sparse. Short lines. Unadorned language. But the simplicity is doing heavy lifting. These conversations aren't about what's being discussed. They're about what's being avoided. Watch how often characters talk around subjects instead of through them. That avoidance becomes the engine of the script. Tension isn't created by conflict. It's created by absence. What should be said, but never quite is. Structurally, the screenplay resists traditional act breaks. There's no clean pivot where the story announces, "Now we're entering the second act." Instead, the narrative drifts, then subtly tightens. Small details introduced early throwaway lines, seemingly inconsequential behaviors, start to echo later with new weight. The script doesn't foreshadow with neon arrows. It trusts memory. If you remember, you're rewarded. If you don't, the film still works, just on a different frequency. One of the boldest writing choices is the refusal to explain Steve psychologically. There's no diagnostic language, no flashbacks engineered to justify his behavior. The screenplay doesn't pathologize him, nor does it redeem him. It simply observes patterns. When he reacts the same way in different situations, the script lets you draw your own conclusions. That's a risky move. Many scripts are terrified of ambiguity. This one leans into it. The pacing on the page must have been a challenge. Scenes often begin late and end early, cutting away before emotional release. Traditional screenwriting wisdom would call this incomplete. Here, it's intentional. The writer understands that closure can be dishonest. Life rarely offers scenes with clean emotional punctuation, so the script refuses to fake it. Moments trail off. Conversations end unresolved, and that lingering discomfort becomes part of the viewing experience. There's also a notable absence of narrative judgment. The script doesn't frame Steve as a problem to be solved or a lesson to be learned. It doesn't guide you toward condemnation or absolution. That neutrality is rare and difficult. It requires enormous confidence in the audience. The writer assumes viewers are capable of sitting with moral complexity without being spoon-fed interpretation. That's not just a stylistic choice, it's a philosophical one. If there were drafts, and there almost certainly were, they likely involved subtracting rather than adding. This feels like a script that found its voice by cutting explanations, trimming dialogue, and trusting subtext. Scenes probably got shorter over time. Lines got cleaner. Silence expanded. The final version feels less written and more discovered, as if the story emerged through careful listening rather than forceful construction. What's especially effective is how the screenplay treats time. Days blur. Weeks pass without announcement. There's no obsession with chronology. The story unfolds in emotional time, not calendar time. That fluidity reinforces the central idea that Steve is stuck, not in a moment, but in a rhythm. The script mirrors that stasis structurally, creating a form-content harmony that feels deliberate and controlled. And yet, beneath all that restraint, the screenplay is quietly daring. It asks a fundamental question without ever stating it outright. If a life doesn't change in obvious ways, does it still matter? Most films answer that with transformation. Steve answers by refusing transformation altogether. That choice begins on the page. It's baked into the story's DNA. Because once you commit to writing a film like this, there's no safety net. No plot twist to save you. No dramatic revelation to justify the journey. Everything depends on precision, on character behavior, on rhythm, on trust. The screenplay lays that groundwork meticulously, and with that foundation in place, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who could embody this kind of writing without overpowering it? Because casting a role this restrained is its own creative gamble. Casting Steve was never going to be about star power. A film this quiet, this resistant to narrative fireworks, would collapse under the weight of a recognizable persona. The central role demands disappearance, not dominance. Whoever stepped into Steve had to erase themselves enough for the character's silences to feel lived in rather than performed. That single requirement narrows the field dramatically and explains why the casting here feels so precise. The role of Steve doesn't invite obvious acting. There are no speeches designed to go viral, no emotional crescendos engineered for awards clips. Most of the work happens in the margins. How he listens, how he avoids eye contact, how his body occupies space when nothing is being asked of him. Casting a performer capable of restraint at that level is harder than casting someone who can cry on cue. The wrong actor would push, the right one would pull back. What makes the casting especially effective is how unremarkable it initially seems. Steve doesn't enter like a protagonist. He's just there. The performance doesn't announce itself as central, and that's by design. The casting choice understands that this character's power comes from accumulation. You notice him more as the film goes on, not because he changes, but because your perception sharpens. That only works if the actor trusts stillness. There's also a subtle tension between familiarity and anonymity in the casting. The actor feels real, grounded, someone you might recognize from life rather than from cinema. That familiarity lowers your guard. You're not watching a performance so much as observing a person. The casting leans into that realism, avoiding the polish that often signals movie stardom. It's an approach that aligns perfectly with the film's observational ethos. Equally important is what the casting avoids. There's no against-type stunt casting here. No ironic subversion meant to generate headlines. That restraint suggests a production more interested in internal coherence than external buzz. The role wasn't about proving range, it was about serving the material. And the casting reflects a confidence that the story doesn't need a hook louder than its own honesty. The supporting roles follow the same philosophy. None of them feel engineered to steal scenes. They exist to reveal facets of Steve by contrast rather than competition. Each actor feels chosen for texture, not volume, a certain cadence of speech, a particular physical presence. The casting creates a world that feels inhabited long before the camera arrived, which is essential for a film so dependent on behavioral authenticity. What's striking is how naturally the ensemble fits together. Conversations don't feel written, they feel overheard. That chemistry doesn't happen by accident. It suggests careful casting sessions focused less on line readings and more on interaction. How actors respond when nothing dramatic is happening. How they sit in silence together. How they interrupt, hesitate, or trail off. Those details matter here more than polish ever could. The casting of Steve, in particular, reflects a deep understanding of the screenplay's demands. This is a character who withholds more than he reveals, and the actor has to make that withholding interesting. Not mysterious in a cinematic sense. Human. There's a difference. Mystery teases answers. Humanity accepts that some questions never get answered. The casting leans into the latter. Age also plays a quiet but crucial role. Steve feels neither young nor old in a narratively convenient way. He exists in that ambiguous middle where expectations start to calcify. Casting an actor who could embody that liminal stage, where change feels both possible and exhausting, anchors the film's thematic core. Too young, and the story becomes about potential. Too old, and it becomes about regret. This casting lands in between, where ambiguity lives. Even the smallest roles feel intentional. No one overplays. No one undercuts the tone. The casting across the board respects the film's refusal to sensationalize. That unity suggests a casting philosophy aligned closely with the director's vision. Find people who don't perform emotion, but allow it to surface naturally. People who understand that sometimes the most honest reaction is no reaction at all. Ultimately, the casting of Steve succeeds because it disappears into the fabric of the film. You don't think about actors making choices. You think about people behaving. That's the highest compliment this kind of movie can receive. And with the right faces now inhabiting the story, the real test begins. Whether those performances can sustain a film built almost entirely on presence, patience, and emotional subtext. Because casting sets the stage, but performance brings it to life. And in a film this stripped down, the margin for error is razor thin. What happens when these actors finally step in front of the camera, when restraint meets execution, is where Steve either holds together or quietly unravels. The performance at the center of Steve doesn't arrive fully formed. It unfolds. Slowly. Almost reluctantly. And that's the point. This isn't an actor announcing a character. It's a human being allowing pieces of himself to surface over time. The brilliance of the lead performance lies not in transformation, but in consistency. Steve is the same man at the beginning and the end. What changes is how clearly you see him. From the opening scenes, the actor makes a radical choice: neutrality. Not blankness, not boredom. Neutrality. Emotional responses are muted, calibrated, often delayed. When something unsettling happens, Steve doesn't react the way cinema has trained us to expect. No sharp intake of breath, no visible collapse, just a slight shift in posture, a pause before answering, a decision not to engage. It's unnerving and completely intentional. Watch his face closely. The performance lives there, but not in obvious ways. Micro-expressions flicker and vanish before you can fully name them. A tightening of the jaw. Eyes that linger a beat too long on the floor. These are not accidents. They're choices rooted in restraint. The actor understands that Steve is someone who has learned, over time, to compress emotion rather than express it. And compression creates pressure. What's remarkable is how physical the performance is without ever becoming demonstrative. Steve's body carries history. The script refuses to spell out. He moves cautiously, conserving energy, as if life has taught him that enthusiasm is expensive. His gestures are economical. Nothing wasted. When he sits, he occupies as little space as possible. When he walks, it's purposeful, but not urgent. This is a man who has adjusted to the world by minimizing friction. There's a scene early on, quiet, easily overlooked, where Steve is listening to someone else talk about their problems. He nods, says almost nothing. Any other actor might use that moment to signal empathy or detachment. Here, it's neither. The performance lands somewhere more uncomfortable. Steve is present, but not available. You can feel the distance even as he remains physically close. That tension becomes a recurring motif. As the film progresses, the performance reveals its architecture. The actor plants emotional seeds, early tiny tells that only pay off later. A habitual deflection. A pattern of avoidance. When similar situations recur, Steve responds the same way, and that repetition becomes devastating. You realize this isn't situational behavior. It's character. The actor isn't reacting to scenes, he's obeying an internal logic. The absence of overt emotional release is what gives the performance its weight. When Steve finally does show something resembling vulnerability, it's not framed as a breakthrough. It's messy, brief, almost accidental. And because the actor has spent so long withholding, that small crack feels seismic. Your chest tightens not because of what he does, but because of how little he allows himself to do. Dialogue delivery is another quiet triumph. Lines are often spoken without emphasis, sometimes even undercutting their own meaning. The actor resists the instinct to land lines correctly. He lets them trail off. He rushes past moments that seem important. It feels wrong at first, then it feels real. People don't always know when they're saying something significant. Steve certainly doesn't. There's a particularly telling moment where Steve is asked a direct question about his life. The pause before he answers is long, uncomfortable. You expect the film to cut away. It doesn't. The actor lets the silence stretch just enough for you to understand what's happening internally. Calculation, deflection, self-protection. When the answer finally comes, it's technically honest and emotionally empty. That contradiction defines the character. What separates this performance from minimalist acting cliches is intention. This isn't an actor doing nothing. This is an actor doing very specific things quietly. Restraint here is active, not passive. Every non-reaction is a choice. Every withheld emotion is deliberate. The performance demands patience, but it rewards it with psychological clarity. Crucially, the actor never asks for sympathy. Steve isn't softened to make him palatable. When he disappoints people, the performance doesn't apologize. When he hurts someone through inaction, the camera doesn't rescue him with charm. That refusal to self-justify is brave. It allows the character to exist without moral framing, which is far harder than playing likable or monstrous. By the final stretch of the film, the performance has done something rare. Without changing in any obvious way, Steve feels completely exposed. You understand him, not because he's explained himself, but because you've watched him choose the same emotional exits again and again. The actor trusts the audience to connect those dots. No hand-holding, no catharsis on cue. This is the kind of performance that grows in memory. On first watch, it can feel opaque. On reflection, it sharpens. Scenes replay differently once you recognize the patterns. That's the mark of deep character work. The actor hasn't played moments, he's built a system of behavior. And yet, for all its inward focus, the performance never feels self-contained. It exists in relation to others, which makes the next layer of the film essential. Because Steve may be the gravitational center, but the people orbiting him, the ones who reflect, challenge, and expose his limits, are what give the performance its full dimensionality. After all, character isn't revealed in isolation, it's revealed in contact. And that's where the rest of this cast steps in. The supporting cast in Steve doesn't exist to decorate the frame or relieve the film's austerity. They function as pressure points. Each one reveals something about Steve, not by confrontation, but by contrast. These performances are calibrated to the same restrained frequency as the lead, yet each carries a distinct emotional temperature. Together, they form an ecosystem, quiet, tense, and deeply human. What stands out first is how none of these characters feel written to serve Steve in a conventional narrative sense. They aren't mentors, antagonists, or romantic foils in any obvious way. They're simply people with their own rhythms and expectations, and that independence is crucial. It allows the ensemble to feel authentic rather than instrumental. When friction occurs, it doesn't feel engineered. It feels inevitable. One supporting performance in particular operates almost like a mirror held at an angle. This character interacts with Steve in small, repeated ways. Conversations that seem casual on the surface, but slowly expose a mismatch in emotional availability. The actor plays these scenes with understated warmth, which makes Steve's emotional economy feel even starker by comparison. No accusations are spoken, none are needed. The contrast does the work. Another key supporting role brings impatience into the film's emotional palette. Where Steve absorbs, this character pushes. The performance is never loud, but there's an undercurrent of frustration that hums beneath every exchange. The actor understands that impatience doesn't have to explode to be felt. It shows up in timing, in sighs that come a second too early, in sentences that end more sharply than they begin. Against Steve's inertia, this energy becomes volatile. The ensemble also excels at inhabiting silence. Scenes often unfold with multiple characters present, yet no one rushes to fill the space. That shared comfort, or discomfort, with quiet suggests an unusual level of collective tuning. These actors aren't competing for attention. They're listening. That listening becomes visible. You feel when someone wants to speak but chooses not to. Those withheld moments accumulate emotional charge. There's a subtle hierarchy within the ensemble that mirrors real-life social dynamics rather than scripted importance. Some characters dominate space naturally, others recede. The performances respect that imbalance without exaggeration. No one overplays dominance or submission. Instead, power shifts moment to moment based on context. A glance, a tone, who's standing, who's sitting, who's sitting, who's sitting, who's sitting. It's behavioral storytelling at its finest. What's especially effective is how the supporting cast never tries to solve Steve. They don't exist to diagnose him or demand transformation. They react to him the way people do in life. Sometimes with patience, sometimes with disappointment, sometimes with resignation. That range of responses makes Steve's emotional stasis feel consequential. His choices, or lack thereof, ripple outward. Chemistry here isn't about charm. It's about friction. The best scenes crackle not because of raised voices, but because of mismatched expectations. One character wants clarity. Steve offers deflection. Another seeks connection. Steve offers proximity without access. The actors play these mismatches with painful accuracy, allowing discomfort to breathe instead of smoothing it over. Even the smallest roles feel purposeful. Brief interactions, a clerk, a neighbor, a casual acquaintance, are played with specificity. No one feels like a placeholder. These micro-performances reinforce the film's worldview. Every interaction matters, even if it doesn't change anything, especially if it doesn't. The ensemble's greatest achievement is how it amplifies the lead performance without overshadowing it. Each actor understands the film's tonal contract. No one breaks it. No one reaches for a bigger emotional beat just to be noticed. That discipline is rare, and it's what allows the film to maintain its emotional integrity from start to finish. By the time the film reaches its later scenes, the cumulative effect of these interactions becomes clear. Steve hasn't changed, but the space around him has tightened. Relationships strain. Silences grow heavier. The ensemble makes that evolution tangible. You feel the cost of emotional withholding not because the film tells you, but because you've watched it erode connections piece by piece. And that erosion doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's embedded in spaces, rooms, streets, environments that quietly reflect the characters who move through them. Which brings us to the film's physical world. Because in Steve, place isn't just backdrop. It's an extension of character. Every wall, every object, every choice of color and texture participates in the storytelling. The human drama unfolds inside a carefully constructed environment, and understanding that environment is key to understanding the film itself. The physical world of Steve feels less designed than inhabited. Nothing calls attention to itself, and that's precisely the achievement. The production design doesn't announce theme through symbolism or visual flourish. It whispers. It lets environments do the quiet work of characterization, turning rooms and objects into emotional extensions of the people who occupy them, especially Steve. Spaces in this film are not expressive, they're functional. Apartments feel lived in, but not curated. Furniture looks chosen for utility, not taste. There's a slight wear to everything, the kind that comes from long-term use rather than neglect. This isn't decay, it's stasis. The production design understands the difference, and that distinction mirrors Steve's inner life perfectly. Nothing is falling apart. Nothing is improving. Everything simply continues. What's striking is how rarely the film offers visual relief. You don't get sweeping exteriors or aspirational spaces. Most scenes unfold in interiors that feel constricted without being claustrophobic. Rooms are modest in size, ceilings unremarkable, walls neutral to the point of anonymity. These spaces don't trap Steve, they accommodate him. They're environments where emotional minimalism makes sense. Color plays a subtle but deliberate role. The palette leans toward muted earth tones, washed-out blues, and soft grays. No bold contrasts. No visual punctuation. The absence of vibrant color isn't bleak. It's honest. This is a world where nothing is highlighted, where moments don't announce importance through aesthetics. Life happens in the same visual register whether it's mundane or quietly devastating. Props are handled with similar restraint. Objects don't carry obvious metaphorical weight, but they accumulate meaning through repetition. The same mug, the same chair, the same corner of the room. You start to recognize Steve's relationship to these objects, not as symbols, but as constants. They're reliable in a way people aren't. The production design leans into that emotional math without ever underlining it. There's an evident commitment to realism in how spaces are arranged. Nothing feels dressed for the camera. Items aren't conveniently placed to create visual symmetry. If something is awkwardly positioned, it stays that way. The design resists cinematic tidiness, which reinforces the film's observational tone. You're not being shown a version of reality optimized for viewing. You're being allowed to observe it as it is. Costume design integrates seamlessly into this philosophy. Steve's clothing doesn't evolve to signal interchange. It remains consistent, practical, almost anonymous. Colors stay neutral. Fits are unremarkable. Nothing draws the eye. This isn't a character hiding. It's a character uninterested in being seen. The wardrobe reflects that without commentary. Other characters, by contrast, introduce slight variations. A brighter color here, a more expressive silhouette there. These differences are never exaggerated, but they register subconsciously. Against Steve's visual consistency, even small deviations feel significant. The production design uses contrast sparingly, which makes it effective when it appears. Lighting choices further reinforce the grounded aesthetic. Interiors rely heavily on practical light sources. Lamps, overhead fixtures, daylight through windows. Shadows fall naturally. Nothing is sculpted for drama. Faces aren't glamorized. This lighting philosophy aligns with the film's refusal to romanticize its subject. Steve is shown as he exists, not as cinema wants him to look. One of the most telling design choices is how spaces don't change even when relationships do. Emotional shifts aren't mirrored by environmental transformation. The room stays the same. The furniture stays put. The world doesn't respond to internal upheaval. That indifference is powerful. It suggests a universe that doesn't care about narrative arcs, a world where meaning must be found internally or not at all. The production design also understands negative space. Empty rooms appear often, either before or after scenes. These moments aren't transitional filler. They're punctuation. They allow the emotional residue of interactions to linger without dialogue. You sit with absence, with what's just happened or what didn't happen. That spatial awareness is deliberate and disciplined. By the time the film progresses, the environments feel intimately familiar. You know these rooms. You know where Steve sits. You know how he moves through them. That familiarity deepens the emotional impact of even the smallest disruptions. When something is out of place, it registers immediately. Not because the film tells you, but because the space has become part of the character. And yet, as grounded and tactile as these spaces are, they're ultimately filtered through the camera's eye. How the film chooses to frame, move, and observe these environments determines how we experience them. The physical world may be quietly constructed, but it's the cinematography that decides how long we look, where we look, and what we're allowed to feel while doing so. Because in Steve, the camera doesn't just capture space, it interprets it. The cinematography of Steve understands something many films forget. The camera doesn't have to persuade you. It doesn't need to underline emotion or chase meaning. It just needs to stay honest. Here, the visual language is defined by patience, distance, and a refusal to intervene. The camera watches. It waits. It allows moments to exist without reshaping them into something more cinematic than they already are. Framing is consistently restrained. Shots are composed with a kind of quiet modesty, balanced, unobtrusive, rarely flashy. Steve is often placed slightly off-center, surrounded by negative space that subtly dwarfs him. The effect isn't isolation in a dramatic sense, it's proportion. He exists within the frame, but he doesn't dominate it. The world isn't bending around him. He's just another element within it. Camera movement is used sparingly, which makes its presence meaningful when it does occur. Most scenes rely on static setups or minimal adjustments, allowing performances and environments to carry the weight. When the camera does move, it's slow and deliberate, almost tentative. No sweeping gestures, no restless tracking. Movement here signals attention, not excitement. Distance is one of the cinematography's most powerful tools. The camera frequently observes Steve from a remove, maintaining a respectful gap rather than pushing into his emotional space. Close-ups are rare, and when they appear, they feel earned rather than indulgent. This choice preserves Steve's interiority. You're allowed to see him, but not to invade him. That boundary is crucial to the film's emotional ethics. Depth of field is handled with equal care. Backgrounds are often kept in focus, grounding characters within their environments instead of isolating them through shallow focus. Steve is rarely separated from his surroundings by blur. He belongs to these spaces, and the camera insists on that connection. When focus does narrow, it feels purposeful, a momentary tightening rather than a stylistic default. The visual rhythm mirrors the film's emotional rhythm. Shots linger longer than you expect. Cuts arrive later than feels comfortable. The cinematography trusts duration as a storytelling tool. By holding on moments after dialogue ends, the camera captures what people do when they think they're no longer being watched. That's where the truth lives. Lighting remains consistent with the film's observational approach. Natural and practical sources dominate, creating an even, unembellished look. Shadows aren't exaggerated for mood. Highlights aren't sculpted for beauty. Faces are lit as they would be in real rooms, at real times of day. This realism doesn't flatten emotion, it clarifies it. You're not distracted by style. You're focused on behavior. There's also a notable absence of visual metaphor. The cinematography doesn't reach for symbolic angles or dramatic compositions to communicate theme. It allows meaning to emerge from repetition and context instead. The same framing choices recur throughout the film, reinforcing the sense of stasis in Steve's life. When variation appears, it's subtle enough that you feel it before you consciously notice it. One of the most telling visual strategies is how the camera handles interactions. Conversations are often shot in wider frames, allowing both participants to share space without privileging one perspective. Shot reverse. shot is used sparingly. Instead, the camera observes exchanges as unified moments. This reinforces the film's interest in relational dynamics rather than individual psychology. There are moments when the camera seems to hesitate, pausing before reframing, delaying a cut, lingering on an empty doorway. These hesitations feel intentional, mirroring Steve's own reluctance to act. The cinematography doesn't just document his behavior, it adopts his tempo. Form and character align. Even exteriors resist romanticization. Streets, buildings, landscapes are presented plainly, without aesthetic enhancement. The world beyond Steve's immediate environment offers no promise of escape. It's not hostile, it's indifferent. The camera captures that indifference with remarkable consistency, never implying that a change of scenery would change anything else. By the film's later passages, the visual language has become so ingrained that you stop noticing it consciously, and that's the highest compliment. The cinematography disappears into function, allowing story and character to dominate without interference. When the final images arrive, they don't announce conclusion. They simply stop observing. The effect is quietly devastating. But images are only half the sensory equation. What we see shapes our understanding, but what we hear shapes our emotional response. In a film this restrained, sound becomes especially powerful, not through volume, but through absence, texture, and timing. The quiet of Steve is not empty, it's carefully constructed. Because when dialogue fades and the camera holds, it's the soundscape that tells you how alone Steve really is. Sound in Steve isn't designed to impress. It's designed to linger. This is a film that understands silence, not as emptiness, but as texture. Every auditory choice, every pause, every ambient hum, every withheld musical cue feels intentional, disciplined, and deeply aligned with the film's emotional philosophy. The soundscape doesn't guide you. It keeps you company. Music, when it appears at all, arrives cautiously. There's no omnipresent score shaping your emotional response from above. Instead, sound exists mostly within the world of the film, diegetic, grounded, unassuming. A radio playing faintly in another room. Distant traffic bleeding through a window. Footsteps echoing slightly longer than expected. These sounds don't decorate scenes. They anchor them. The absence of music in key moments is especially telling. Scenes that most films would underscore with emotional cues are left bare here. Conversations unfold without harmonic support. Moments of tension breathe without sonic scaffolding. That restraint forces you to sit with the rawness of interaction. You're not being told what to feel. You're being asked to feel it on your own terms. When music does surface, it's understated to the point of fragility. Simple motifs. Sparse instrumentation. Notes that feel tentative rather than declarative. The music never swells into catharsis. It appears briefly, then retreats, like an emotion Steve himself refuses to dwell on. The score mirrors the character's internal economy present, but controlled. Sound design plays an equally crucial role in shaping the film's psychological space. Everyday noises are amplified, not in volume, but in attention. The clink of cutlery, the whir of an appliance, the subtle creak of furniture as someone shifts their weight. These sounds gain prominence because nothing competes with them. In the quiet, they become loud. There's a recurring use of ambient noise that borders on oppressive, not because it's harsh, but because it's harsh, but because it's constant. Background sounds rarely fade completely. They persist beneath conversations, beneath silences, beneath moments that feel emotionally significant. That persistence creates a sense of emotional claustrophobia. Even when nothing is happening, something is always there. You can't escape the world's low-level hum. Dialogue is mixed with remarkable naturalism. Voices aren't polished or isolated unnaturally. They exist within spaces, shaped by rooms and distance. Characters sometimes speak softly enough that you have to lean in mentally. Other times, words are swallowed by ambient sound. This isn't poor mixing. It's a commitment to realism, People aren't always heard clearly. Miscommunication lives in that ambiguity. One of the film's most effective sonic strategies is how it handles pauses. Silence between lines is rarely total. There's almost always a faint environmental sound filling the gap. That choice prevents silence from feeling dramatic or artificial. It feels lived in. The pauses aren't cinematic beats, they're human hesitations. The soundscape also reinforces Steve's emotional isolation. He's often framed in spaces where sound feels distant or diffused, as if he's slightly out of sync with his environment. Conversations sound muted. Laughter feels removed. Even when he's physically present, the audio design subtly suggests separation. He hears the world, but it doesn't quite reach him. There's no sonic payoff in the traditional sense. No climactic musical resolution. No audio crescendo that signals emotional release. The film denies that satisfaction deliberately. The sound design understands that not all stories resolve, and not all emotions deserve closure. Sometimes, the most honest ending is quiet continuation. What's remarkable is how cohesive the audio landscape feels with every other element of the film. Sound doesn't compete with cinematography or performance. It complements them. The restraint is shared. The philosophy is unified. Nothing reaches for attention. Everything earns it. By the end, you become acutely aware of how much the film has trained your ears. You notice absence. You notice subtle shifts. You notice when a sound drops out entirely. That heightened awareness is part of the experience. The film doesn't just tell a story, it recalibrates perception. And once you've absorbed that careful orchestration of image and sound, the next layer reveals itself. How something so quiet, so precise, actually came into existence. Because films like Steve don't happen easily. They require conviction, patience, and a production process willing to protect fragility at every step. What happened behind the camera matters here because the way Steve was made is inseparable from how it feels. The production journey of Steve feels almost inseparable from the film's final tone. You can sense it in every frame. This was not a movie forced into existence by momentum or market pressure. It was protected. Carefully. Deliberately. Films this quiet survive production only when everyone involved understands exactly what kind of movie they're making and what it must not become. The shoot itself appears designed around limitation rather than expansion. Modest locations. Controlled environments. A schedule that favors patience over coverage. Instead of chasing options in the edit, the production seems to have committed early to precision. Scenes are staged with confidence, not contingency. That kind of decisiveness usually comes from a director who knows the film will be lost the moment compromise creeps in. One of the defining challenges of producing Steve would have been defending stillness. On set, silence can feel uncomfortable. Time stretches. Crew members instinctively want to speed things up. But this film depends on time being allowed to exist inside the frame. That means resisting the pressure to rush performances, to add movement, to punch scenes up for imagined audience attention spans. Someone had to hold that line every day. The actor at the center likely worked without the usual safety nets. No coverage designed to fix things later. No indulgent improvisation meant to create options. Performances had to land in the moment, within the frame, as intended. That's a vulnerable way to work. It requires trust between director and actor and camera, crew and material. You can feel that trust on screen. Environmental control also plays a role. The consistency of sound, light, and space suggests a production that valued continuity over convenience. Rather than reshaping locations to suit the camera, the production adapted the camera to the locations. That's harder. It limits where you can place equipment. It restricts angles. But it preserves authenticity. And authenticity is the film's currency. There's little evidence of production excess. No sequences that feel like logistical flexing. No moments that scream, "We had the resources, so we used them." Everything serves intimacy. That restraint likely extended behind the scenes as well. Lean crews, efficient setups, a workflow that prioritized calm. Chaos would have been poison for this film. What's fascinating is how the film's emotional restraint mirrors its production discipline. You can imagine a set where voices stayed low, where direction was minimal, where adjustments were subtle rather than sweeping. A place where actors weren't pushed toward emotion, but given space to arrive there, or not. That atmosphere matters. Performances like this don't survive aggressive energy. Editing decisions, too, reflect confidence in what was captured. Scenes end where they end. Shots linger because they were meant to. There's no sense of finding the movie later. The movie was already there. Post-production didn't reshape it, it refined it. The rhythm feels preserved, not manufactured. Even the absence of obvious behind-the-scenes anecdotes feels appropriate. Films like Steve don't generate chaos stories or dramatic rescues. Their triumph is quieter. They make it through intact. That's the success. Not spectacle, but survival without compromise. What ultimately defines the production journey of Steve is intentionality. Every limitation feels chosen. Every restraint feels defended. This wasn't a film that accidentally turned out quiet. It fought to stay that way. And that fight doesn't end when cameras stop rolling, because once the film exists, it has to face the world. Audiences, numbers, expectations, the cold arithmetic of reception. And that's where a film like Steve enters dangerous territory, because commercial metrics aren't designed to measure subtlety. What happens when something this restrained meets the marketplace says as much about the industry as it does about the film itself. When Steve entered the marketplace, it was never going to play by the usual rules. Films like this don't arrive with thunder. They slip in quietly, almost apologetically, and then wait to see who notices. Measuring their success requires a different lens, one that understands that commercial impact isn't always loud, immediate, or numeric in the way blockbusters demand. The release strategy itself tells you everything. Steve was not positioned as an event. There was no saturation marketing, no urgency-driven campaign built around opening weekend dominance. The film trusted discovery over demand. That's a risky approach in any year. But in 2025, when algorithms reward instant engagement, it borders on defiance. The assumption here was simple. The right audience would find it, even if slowly. Opening performance, in that context, becomes almost irrelevant. This is not a film designed to spike. It's designed to persist. Its value lies in consistency rather than velocity. Films like Steve tend to perform modestly at first, then stabilize, held aloft by word of mouth rather than spectacle. If you blink looking for headlines, you miss the story entirely. What matters more is how the film held its ground. Quiet films that fail disappear quickly. Screens evaporate. Showtimes vanish. The fact that Steve maintained presence, whether in limited theatrical runs, curated cinema programs, or later digital circulation, speaks to a form of success that rarely makes charts. Longevity is the metric here, not magnitude. The audience response likely followed a familiar pattern for restrained character studies. Small, but passionate. Viewers who connected didn't just like the film, they advocated for it. These are the kinds of movies people recommend carefully, almost personally. This might not be for you, but that qualifier is a badge of honor. It means the film is specific enough to divide rather than dilute. Commercially, Steve exists in the space between profitability and prestige. It doesn't need to recoup massive costs to justify itself, and it doesn't rely on mass appeal to validate its existence. Its economics are built around sustainability. Modest expectations. Controlled budgets. Returns measured over time rather than weekends. That's a disappearing model. And this film quietly proves it still works. Streaming and on-demand platforms likely became the film's second life, not as background viewing, but as intentional selection. Steve isn't a movie people stumble into. It's one people choose. That distinction matters. It affects how the film is watched, how it's discussed, and how it's remembered. Passive consumption would kill it. Active engagement keeps it alive. There's also cultural capital to consider. Even without massive revenue, films like Steve accrue value through reputation. They become reference points, the kind of movie other filmmakers cite, the kind critics revisit, the kind that sneaks into year-end lists not because it dominated, but because it lingered. That slow accumulation of respect is its own form of currency. From an industry perspective, Steve represents a counter-argument to prevailing assumptions. It suggests there's still room commercially and creatively for films that don't shout, that not every release needs to justify itself through scale. For producers and distributors paying attention, that's the real impact. Not the raw numbers, but the proof of concept. And yet, commercial performance is only half the equation. Numbers tell you how many people watched. They don't tell you how the film was received once it was seen. That story lives elsewhere, in reviews, debates, quiet praise, and divided reactions. Because Steve was never going to be universally embraced, it was always going to provoke a more interesting response than that. How critics and audiences wrestled with this film, where they praised it, where they resisted it, reveals just how uncompromising its vision really was. The critical response to Steve revealed a familiar fault line, one that always appears when a film refuses to perform for approval. Critics didn't argue about craftsmanship. That part was largely agreed upon. The debate centered on patience, on expectation, on whether cinema owes its audience momentum, or whether it can simply offer presence and ask viewers to meet it halfway. Many critics recognized immediately what the film was attempting. Reviews often framed Steve as a work of deliberate minimalism, praising its discipline and emotional honesty. The language used to describe it leaned toward words like observational, restrained, and uncompromising, not as euphemisms, but as acknowledgments of intent. This was a film that knew exactly what it was doing and refused to apologize for it. At the same time, resistance was inevitable. Some critics found the film frustrating, even inert. Complaints about pacing surfaced frequently, not because scenes were poorly constructed, but because they refused to escalate. For viewers conditioned to narrative payoff, Steve felt withholding. That reaction says less about the film's quality than about the contract it refuses to sign. It doesn't promise satisfaction. It promises honesty. What's telling is how often negative critiques still respected the film's integrity. Even detractors rarely accused it of laziness or incompetence. The criticism was philosophical, not technical. I see what it's doing. I just don't want to spend time there. That's a valid response, and one the film seems prepared to accept. Audience reactions followed a similar split, though often more polarized. Viewers who connected with Steve spoke about recognition rather than entertainment. They didn't describe being thrilled or moved in conventional terms. They described feeling seen, uncomfortable, exposed. These responses tended to linger. People didn't forget the film. They carried it quietly. Others disengaged early. The film's refusal to guide emotion or accelerate narrative proved alienating for some audiences. And again, that outcome feels baked into the design. Steve doesn't negotiate its terms. It doesn't adapt itself to please. It waits. If you stay, you're rewarded. If you leave, it doesn't chase you. Culturally, the film sparked conversation less through spectacle than through contrast. Released into a cinematic landscape dominated by maximalism, Steve felt almost confrontational in its simplicity. Critics contextualized it as a countercurrent, a reminder of what cinema looks like when it turns away from performance and back toward observation. Over time, the discourse around Steve began to shift. Initial reactions, especially those focused on pacing, softened into appreciation for its consistency. Rewatchability emerged as a recurring theme. Viewers who returned to the film found it clearer, sharper, more emotionally legible on second viewing. What once felt slow began to feel precise. Awards attention, if any, remained modest and selective. This is not the kind of film that sweeps ceremonies. It's the kind that earns quiet nominations, thoughtful mentions, respectful citations. Recognition here functions as validation rather than celebration. A nod from institutions that value restraint as much as ambition. Perhaps the most meaningful reception came from within the filmmaking community itself. Films like Steve often resonate strongest with those who understand how difficult they are to make. Its influence is subtle but real, visible in conversations, in references, in the confidence it gives other quiet films to exist. In the end, Steve didn't divide audiences because it failed to communicate. It divided them because it communicated clearly, and not everyone wanted to listen. That clarity is its strength. And it leads directly to the film's lasting question: what does a movie like this leave behind once the conversation fades? Because legacy isn't built only on noise. Sometimes it's built on resonance. And that resonance is where Steve ultimately makes its case. By the time Steve reaches its final moments, it becomes clear that the film has never been chasing resolution. It's been circling something quieter, harder to articulate, the weight of a life lived without dramatic rupture. The film's themes don't announce themselves through dialogue or symbolism. They emerge through repetition, through pattern, through the slow realization that stasis can be just as consequential as change. At its core, Steve is about emotional withholding, not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a condition to be observed. Steve isn't broken in a cinematic sense. He functions, he shows up, he participates, but he withholds access, both from others and from himself. The film treats this not as pathology, but as adaptation. Somewhere along the way, Steve learned that feeling less was safer. The tragedy isn't that he's unhappy. It's that he's numb enough not to notice what that costs him. There's also a deeper theme of moral neutrality running through the film. Steve refuses to label its protagonist as good or bad, kind or cruel. His harm is passive, his damage indirect. And that ambiguity is unsettling because it mirrors real life more closely than cinema usually dares to. The film asks a difficult question without ever verbalizing it. How responsible are we for the damage caused by our absence? Time plays a crucial thematic role as well. This is not a story about a turning point. It's about accumulation. Small choices repeated until they calcify into identity. Steve doesn't wake up one day and decide who he is. He becomes himself through inertia. The film's structure reinforces this idea relentlessly. Nothing forces change. Nothing intervenes. Life simply continues, and that continuation becomes the verdict. There's an almost existential undercurrent to the film's worldview. Meaning isn't discovered through achievement or transformation here. It's revealed through attention. The film suggests that if you want to understand a person, you don't look for their biggest moments. You watch their smallest ones, how they respond when nothing is at stake, how they behave when no one is watching. That's where truth lives. In terms of legacy, Steve occupies a specific, important niche. It's not a film that reshapes the industry or launches trends. Its influence is quieter, more intimate. It gives permission. Permission for filmmakers to trust restraint. Permission for audiences to sit with discomfort. Permission for stories that don't resolve to still matter. Those permissions ripple outward slowly, but they last. Within the broader cinematic landscape, Steve will likely be remembered as a reference point rather than a landmark. The kind of film people cite when explaining why minimalism still has power. The kind that gets recommended with a caveat and cherished because of it. It won't be everyone's favorite. It doesn't want to be. It wants to be honest. Rewatchability becomes part of its endurance. The film changes as you change. Early viewings might feel distant. Later ones feel clarifying. Patterns emerge. Choices sharpen. Steve becomes less opaque, not because he reveals more, but because you've learned how to read him. That's rare. Most films give you everything up front. This one asks you to earn understanding. As a final verdict, Steve is a film of conviction. It knows its limits and embraces them. Its restraint is not an affectation. It's an ethic. Every creative decision aligns with a central belief. that cinema can observe without explaining, feel without performing, and matter without shouting. That belief won't satisfy everyone. It was never meant to. For viewers willing to meet it on its own terms, Steve offers something increasingly rare: a space to think, to sit, to feel without instruction. It doesn't tell you what to take away. It trusts you to decide whether what you've seen reflects something uncomfortable, familiar, or quietly devastating. And when it ends, it doesn't linger with a final statement or symbolic image. It simply stops watching. Steve goes on. Life continues. No lesson delivered. No transformation confirmed. Just a man, unchanged and understood.